Hey everybody, welcome back to the Now It's Dark movie podcast here with Mike.
And this is Tim, and it's been a while since our first episode on Twin Peaks. We talked about Twin Peaks: The Return, Season 3, but we're back, and we wanted to do something that kind of was a continuation of what we were doing before, and hopefully something that our audience, who are mostly Twin Peaks fans, would be interested in. And that would be Blade Runner, 1982, the original Blade Runner, and the follow-up to that from last year, Blade Runner 2049. There will be massive spoilers here, so make sure that you've watched Blade Runner, the original, and Blade Runner 2049 before listening to the rest of this. And if you haven't, bookmark it and come back to it later.
Yeah, both views of the future, though not necessarily optimistic ones.
Kind of in the vein of Twin Peaks, they're not afraid to be dark and dystopian in many ways. It is funny because we're recording this right now at night. It's a very rainy evening.
Yeah, quite appropriate.
This kind of weather instantly kind of brings to mind the look of Blade Runner. And anytime you mention that, it's an instant shorthand, I think, for a lot of people. I think it is the aesthetic of the original Blade Runner, and specifically the production design, which is kind of the movie's most enduring legacy, I would say.
Yeah.
Because if you take a look at the novel by Philip K. Dick, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, it's very much about the, examining the difference between the human and the android, whether empathy can exist in an android being.
Right.
The movie, I think, has endured because it does take a look at those themes, but it builds on top of it by creating an aesthetic to match this sort of, future-looking vision.
Yeah, it really is a very cinematic experience.
Yeah.
It really translates very well from the novel to the silver screen.
Absolutely. And it's been so influential as well, like in the cyberpunk genre that emerged in the 80s with William Gibson and others, Japanese anime, Akira, and just a lot of science fiction films. I mean, just you cannot look at The Matrix without seeing so many things that come from Blade Runner.
And not only movies, you look at video games. I mean, the whole world of the BioShock video games,
right.
The underwater city, it just looks exactly like Blade Runner,
Right.
but it's just underwater.
Yeah, it has a certain mix of old and new that's very much reminiscent of Blade Runner. And what's interesting, if we take a look at Blade Runner 1982, the original version, Ridley Scott himself was trained as an art designer. And he was also a veteran commercial director. He directed tons of commercials up until that point. So he was really kind of immersed in cutting-edge 80s aesthetics.
He knew what was in vogue and everything and in fashion.
And he knew what to tell people, what he wanted and what he didn't want. He worked really closely with the production designer on Blade Runner, Lawrence Paul, and he actually hired a futurist as well by the name of Sid Mead, who kind of just, drew all of these sketches to kind of start off the process of envisioning and conceptualizing this world.
Right. And, the thing that I really appreciate about the look of Blade Runner is that if you look at movies like, Star Wars, for instance, let's take a look at the prequels. Coruscant doesn't really look anything like modern society. But if you look at Blade Runner, it takes place in the future and there are ships flying, but at the same time, there are still rain-soaked sidewalks and people just kind of getting from one place to another and people going to work, and it's still very much familiar.
And I think one of the interesting things about what Blade Runner did, it was one of the first big science fiction films that took high technology to the street level.
Yeah.
Like technology is everywhere in this movie. You see the Tyrell Corporation. It's just this gleaming,
It's this giant pyramid in the middle of a city.
Yeah. But then you also go down to the street levels and it's just saturated with technology. It really does explore the idea of just technology taking over almost every aspect of your life and being part of every element and level of society. But I think by doing that, it had to deal with a bunch of questions about how technology was reshaping society.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, if you take a look at an earlier sci-fi film like Metropolis,
right,
1927.
I love that movie.
I love it too. It's Fritz Lang. It's a real landmark. But it portrays a world in which technology is kind of it structures society, but it's really only cooked up in these kind of ivory towers by
Hmm.
these centralized planners.
Yeah, it's technology is for the elite.
Right.
You know,
And
they're the people who are controlling the machines, and then you poor suckers are working these machines.
right.
Yeah,
It to the extent that it affects the average person, it's just as a controlling,
yeah,
managing sort of thing.
right.
So in that sense, there's a real clear division between those who control technology and the masses.
Yeah,
And so social divisions are fairly simplified, I think. If you give the masses the technology, or at least, access to a lot of technology, obviously not all of it, the rich
right.
still control the biggest and the best.
Yeah,
But if you give the masses access to a lot of powerful technology, it totally restructures how society functions.
mm-hmm,
And in Blade Runner, there really are no masses.
mm-hmm.
I mean, the masses that rise up and rebel in Metropolis are nowhere to be found in Blade Runner.
Yeah, everyone's so downtrodden.
It's so downtrodden, divided,
Yeah,
alienated. Not only
hiding
from
in the shadows because there are so many. Like it's just so gloomy and dark on the street. It
right,
doesn't really. There's nothing really that matches the colorful neon advertisements that are basically in the sky because the buildings are so tall.
right.
And nothing really quite captures the same gleam of the Pyramid Tyrell Corporation.
Yeah, it's still very much a world divided by
Mm-hmm.
class, but it's also a world where technology has infused the lower stratas of society.
Yeah.
And I think in order to kind of represent the social reality that went along with this look, they had to bring in film noir to do it. Because that was a genre that was based around social alienation,
Mm-hmm.
suspicion, paranoia, where you just had all these individuals kind of not able to trust each other, kind of really divided up from one another and questioning each other's motives. And in bringing that genre in, I think it allowed them to kind of deal with the social reality that this look implied.
Mm-hmm.
And it also, allowed them to mix the film noir type look, the high contrast look with, all this amazing technology and all these amazing sets.
Right. I mean, because I think maybe most people might associate film noir with movies maybe from like the 40s or something.
Right.
Right. And here you have a film noir movie that's also science fiction and set in the future.
Right.
That's what made it so unique at the time. And the original cut also had this sort of classic style narration.
That voiceover that was kind of ordered by the studios and
Yeah.
tacked on at the final minute just to kind of
Right.
explain things,
Mm-hmm.
but very noirish.
Yeah, very noirish. Yeah. Regardless of whether you like the voiceover or not, I mean that is very noir right there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So what you get out of all this, I think, is this kind of hodgepodge of different individuals and groups. There's elements of multiculturalism there. There's a lot of characters from different parts of the world, but they don't really interact. And to the extent that they do, it's mostly when they have to buy things from each other or when they're doing work.
Mm-hmm.
It's really determined by capitalism. Um,
Everyone else just kind of keeps to themselves for the
Ye-
most part.
yeah, they really do. I mean,
Yeah.
Rick Deckard, the main character, seemingly has no friends.
Yeah.
There's never a moment where he just kind of goes amongst his people and kind of hangs out or has fun or relaxes. And I think not only the characters alienated from each other, but they're also kind of alienated from themselves,
Right.
especially in the case of Deckard and Rachel.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they don't know who they are.
Yeah.
Rachel is shocked to find out that she's a replicant.
Mm-hmm.
Rick Deckard is troubled the whole film, as kind of is the audience, by the question of whether he's a replicant. Which really made me curious about Blade Runner 2049, how it would handle this look, which was just such a part of our modern cinematic vocabulary. And I think in almost every respect, Denis Villeneuve's Blade Runner 2049 kind of stays true to the look and feel of its predecessor.
Yeah, I think he did well. I think he did well with 2049. I told you before, one of my biggest worries for 2049 was that it was going to be modernized, quote unquote, I suppose you could say, because I think if Blade Runner were to come out today for the first time, it would
Mhm.
have just been this loud, noisy explosion fest. Because you think about it, today, 2018, a movie about someone searching for four robots. It's not going to be a quiet, thoughtful film noir mystery, right?
Yeah.
Probably not. So I was a little bit concerned that maybe he was going to go that route, and I'm glad he didn't.
Well, this gets into what I think might be some of the problems with Blade Runner 2049.
Hmm.
Because when I saw it, and I know we talked about this, we saw it together, there was something about it that just felt off. And I've
Hmm.
been wrestling with that question ever since I've seen it
Okay.
and kind of going back and forth in my minds. I think, in a way, the expansiveness of the second film does kind of take away from the kind of noirish, I'll say romantic alienation of the first one.
Okay.
There's this kind of comfortably hermetic feel to the first film.
Hmm.
Deckard's home, most of the interior spaces, they seem to be kind of comfortably closed off.
Yeah, they're really cramped. All the spaces are really small.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it does give it this sense of like a place of refuge,
Hmm.
at least in Deckard's home. Um, has the feel of a place that's been left behind or abandoned by all the people going to the off-world colony. And for me, there's something kind of, it's more noirish because of that. And I think because the second film is more focused on kind of, traversing frontiers and traveling with that spinner, it has more of a sci-fi feel to it.
Okay. Right.
Um,
So you think it kind of goes a little bit too far away from the film noir and more into a general sci-fi.
well, I think both films have an interesting mix of both.
Right.
I just prefer the first ones.
Right. Okay. So I see what you mean. So the first one is a mix, of course, but with leaning a little bit more towards film noir. And the second one, again, it's a mix, but it's more sci-fi.
I would say so. Yeah, that's one thing that's kind of come to my mind.
Hmm.
I think the spaces are less full of suspicion and alienation and a little bit more just outrightly hostile.
Hmm.
For example, when he's going to the orphanage, people there are just outwardly hostile
Yeah.
towards him.
Yeah.
There's none of the kind of noirish. It's like visiting a hostile planet or something. That's the feeling that it gave me.
Yeah, I think part of what makes the first one feel a bit more like a noir is that they are kind of just stuck in that one city the whole time.
Yes.
That so maybe if you expand it, if you make it too big, it's not really a noir anymore. It's kind of more of an epic.
I think more consequential to the success of Blade Runner 2049 is the backstory, the series of mini films that they commissioned
Yeah.
prior to the release of this to kind of fill in what happened over these 30 years. And it kind of answers a question which I think the production designers had, which is this. If you are trying to maintain continuity with the original film, how do you deal with the fact that analog tech has kind of declined in favor of digital?
Mhm.
And their answer to this was to make this kind of plot device where digital records were wiped out
Mhm.
by a terrorist attack, which forced a lot of corporations and companies to resort to analog record taking. I think though with that plot device, I mean it is cool to see this analog tech mixed with digital, but it kind of prevents them from going all the way and dealing with how social reality has changed. Because, I mean, the first film was really imagining how social reality would change with all of this, these futuristic developments.
Mhm.
And the second film, I think, really could have dealt with the consequences of digital technology better.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think this is one of the big problems of films today. How do you portray human relations that take place largely via text messaging
Mhm.
or communication that is largely non-physical or largely inactive? People on their phones communicating and not really moving or doing anything.
Right.
And how do you do that in a way which, consistent with the Blade Runner world, where you don't, like, say, Tron, for example,
Yeah.
go into this virtual thing and portray it in a imaginative sense?
Well, in the 2049 they have him in his digital fake holographic girlfriend.
Joy.
Joy, yeah.
Yeah, that's one solution to that,
Yeah.
I think.
And then there's the neon sign that actually kind of that's kind of like augmented reality, which is
right.
becoming more and more featured in today's world. That advertisement turns around right towards K and just actually comes up to him.
You look lonely. I can fix that.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, the best example of them trying to deal with that. But there's something kind of unsatisfying about it, I think. Like it's dealing with it in a way that doesn't feel too different from today's world.
Mhm.
Whereas I think the first one was a leap ahead.
Yeah.
It was already presuming this social reality that didn't quite exist yet, where this is just kind of like working through something that kind of is already existing right now.
Well, that's the thing about science fiction, though, is that science fiction often inspires and innovates technologies that don't exist at the time.
Right.
And so maybe technology has already caught up or is catching up quicker than expected to the world of Blade Runner.
Yeah, and that's fine.
Mhm.
And in a sense, it's inescapable
Mhm.
that a science fiction film is going to suffer from those, potential problems.
Yeah.
I just wish Blade Runner 2049 had taken that extra leap in trying to imagine, perhaps in a more satisfying way, what this would do to society.
All right, and listeners, thanks very much for being here. Hopefully we'll be back in a shorter time than before.
Yeah, absolutely. Stay tuned for more. We will be more consistent with this. And be sure to give us a like and subscribe if you enjoyed this, so you can stay tuned for more content. If there's anything you'd like to talk about with regards to Blade Runner or anything you'd like us to focus on in the future, leave us a comment below, and we'll get back to you.